Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us with this this month's Renew, Rebuild Hawaii webinar on microgrids. But just to get us started, microgrids are a pretty broad topic, and there's a lot of things you can talk about in microgrids, but we're going to focus on how microgrids, ranging in size from single residence or business, medical centers and distribution centers, to entire communities and small businesses, can play an important role in post-disaster power recovery. And after disasters, there's a lot of problems that are going on, and we'll hear about some of those from some of the speakers. But just I highlighted a couple of things that are kind of unique to Hawaii. Number one is I like to say we have a 2,500-mile moat around us, which means the cavalry's not coming for a little while. So we're not like other states that can have the neighboring utilities from other states drive in and pre-position assets and things like that. Number two, we're highly dependent on imported food and energy. And that ties into my number three, which is severely damaged seaports and aeroports mean we may not be able to get critical items in for several days, weeks, and maybe even months if it's serious damage. And the last point I'd like to make is we haven't had a major disaster here in Hawaii for probably several decades, Hurricane Ian and Eva. And I really don't think our general population is prepared. And to back that up, I'd say as soon as we hear a hurricane coming, everybody goes and gets toilet paper. Well, if you're on the 30th floor of an apartment building, after 3 days, you don't have water, so you don't have to worry about toilet paper. You have to worry about finding a place to go to the bathroom. We have some really serious issues that people need to be considering.
That's right.
So we're gonna look at some of those, and Hawaii can learn from the recent disasters in the Caribbean and the Southeast United States in particular. So we've invited our panelists to share their experiences in preparing for and responding to one of the most common threats we have in island nations, which is hurricanes and typhoons. Our guests today include Kaitlyn Bunker, who responded to the recent back-to-back hurricanes in the Caribbean, Devin De Wulf, who shared his own residential microgrid in his community after the hurricanes that devastated Louisiana, Mr. Allan Schurr, who designs and develops microgrids for our industry and for the United States military with an eye on resiliency, Paul Ponthieux from Blue Planet Research on the Big Island, who will give us a little snapshot of our Hawaiian microgrid in Pu'uwa'awa. And our final presenter today will be Ken Aramaki from Hawaiian Electric to share how Hawaiian Electric plans to respond to our next natural disaster, as well as plan for the resiliency and sustainability of our grid as we move towards our clean energy goals of 2045. But we're going to start off with an overview of storm impacts of the state's economy by Eugene Tian, my favorite. I used to say my favorite D-bed economist, but now he's just my favorite economist, period. Because my neighbor is Paul. Anyway, he's this another business economist. He's 2 doors down, but he's kind of pissed me off with his trees dumping in my yard. So Eugene has now taken over first place for my favorite economist. So Eugene, I want to hand it over to you to give us a picture of what disasters do to the state of Hawaii in terms of our economy.
Okay, thank you, Stan. Let me show my slide. So you see my slide. I have a few slides to show that mainly Mike and Stan want me to talk about the hurricane, the impact. So my title is Hurricanes and Electricity Consumption. So in the past 60, 70 years, we have 12 major hurricanes. And the major one caused damage is actually the 2 of them. It's Eva in 1982, November 1982, and Iniki in 1992. So the damage in terms of $20 in terms of million, Iniki was about 3.5 billion. So this is in billion, 3.5 billion. For Eva is about $688.5 million. So I think the probability to have one major hurricane is less than 50%, but in the next year. But in the next 5 years, the probability of one at least major hurricane is about 100%. So you can see that the longest interval is about 19 years, and the shorter one, in the most recent years, the shorter one is every 2 years. You can see from 2014, 16, 18, then 2020. So it's almost every 2 years there is one, but the one caused a major damage is the last one was 2018 on Maui, caused about $25.8 million damage. What happened to, mainly I want to talk about Iwa and Iniki. So the impact is actually mainly on Kauai and Oahu. You can see Iwa happened in November 1982. It was a decrease by about 1,000 hotel room unit in 1983. And for Iniki, the major impact is only over half of the impact is on Kauai. So you can see in 1992, this is in September, so there were 7,778 hotel rooms. It's decreased by about more than 3,000 in 1993. It takes about 12 years to recover for Kauai to the pre-Iniki level. So what happened to the electricity consumption? So you look at the Kauai electricity consumption, and this is in terms of Kauai electricity sales. And in 1982-83, the impact is very no impact. We still see the increase in the electricity consumption in between 1982 and 1993, but there is an impact in the electricity consumption from Iniki. So before Iniki was 370 million kilowatt hours, and it's decreased, but the decrease is about, it takes 4 years to recover for the electricity consumption. So the impact on Kauai is bigger. On the electricity is about 4 years recovery period. What about Oahu? We do see some change in the hotel unit, in the visitor unit from Iwa is a decrease. From Iniki is a decrease, but there are other impact also at the same time. So the decrease on Oahu is not significant, but the decrease has been decreasing for actually on Oahu in terms of visitor unit. It was about 25 years. It took a long time, but it may not be the Iniki impact, is some other impact. So it took Hawaii from 5 million visitors or 6 million visitors, 7 million.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about, so you sent yesterday an email about the notes from the meeting, and then you wrote down, or you highlighted.
So for Oahu, for our Hawaii visitor arrivals from 6 million to 7 million, it took about 18 years. So this is the timing for Oahu. It may not be the impact of the hurricanes, but we see the Oahu electricity sales. You can see the impact on, this is the impact from the Iwa. You can see there is no impact, it's still increasing. And from the Iniki, there was an impact, is a decrease from 1991 to 1992 to 1993. There was a slight decrease, then it go back again. So the impact on Oahu is about a year, and the impact on Kauai is about 4 years. So then the impact on the property damage is actually impact the whole economy. If you look at the Kauai visitor arrivals, from Iniki, the impact in 92 and 93, there was a big decrease, and it took a long time for Kauai to recover to the pre-Iniki level. And the electricity consumption here is just to show that actually the visitor arrival on Kauai, it was stagnant for about over 10 years, but the electricity consumption is recovered quickly in 4 years, then it's continued to increase. So this analysis shows that, I think that today and yesterday there was a newspaper article about the visitor use of utilities And I think our analysis shows that the electricity or utility consumption is not very sensitive to the arrivals, the number of visitors, but is actually sensitive to the number of properties. If you close the hotel completely, like 1993 on Kauai, that's actually impact the electricity consumption, because it's mainly because electricity consumption for the visitors, there are two parts. One is the fixed consumption for the common areas, and it is the variable consumption is due to the number of rooms or number of visitors. When you look at the Oahu visitor arrivals, and this is a unique impact, and there was a decrease in visitors, but the decrease continues to about a long time, about 20 years. But you look at the electricity consumption continues to increase until 2006, and then it's decreased. The decrease is due to two main reasons. One is the PV panel installation actually started in 2008, and it became a peak in 2012 and continues into today. And also the second factor for electricity consumption on Oahu, it is mainly, actually it's on all the island, it's mainly because of the energy efficiency appliances and light bulbs. So energy efficiency measures, and also the PV installation. So that caused the electricity consumption to decrease. So I have a few takeaways from this short analysis. Hurricanes cause life loss and damages to properties. The largest damage in the past was Hurricane Iniki that caused Kauai lost 3,150 hotel rooms. Electricity consumption was negatively impacted immediately when damage occurred. The impact could last 1 year for Oahu from our experience, and 3 years, because 4 years to recover. So 3 years will be done for Kauai. I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Eugene. And our next presenter is Kaitlyn Bunker. And she's going to be talking about her experiences in the Caribbean after the last couple of hurricanes ripped through there and caused significant damage to a lot of the islands in that chain, in that area down there. So Kaitlyn, could you start off by just telling us a little bit about yourself before you jump into your presentation?
Yes, happy to. Great to be with all of you today. Thanks for having me. I'm Kaitlyn Bunker, one of the directors of the Islands Energy Program at Aramaki. Aramaki is a nonprofit organization working around the globe focused on clean energy. Really, our mission is around transforming the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, zero carbon future for all. So we work in all different industries that use energy, including electricity. And my team is focused in the Caribbean. So we've been working in the region about the last 7 years or so, partnering with islands to define what they want their clean energy transition to look like, what their priorities are, and then how to get there, doing the analysis of what the future energy system could look like, and supporting specific projects on the ground, getting these projects implemented to move towards each island's vision. So I'm excited to share a bit about our experience after the 2017 hurricane season. Let me share my screen here and just make it full screen. How does that look? Are you seeing the notes?
I see the notes screen, Kaitlyn.
Yeah, we're seeing the notes.
See if we can swap. How's that look?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So this is just more introduction to our team. As I mentioned, we've been working in the Caribbean region since about 2014 and have worked with 19 different islands in the region. Most of those are highlighted here. And you know, this is really what we're talking about today, the impact of hurricanes. Of course, hurricanes have caused significant impact in the Caribbean as well as in Hawaii. Here's a couple of photos, all after the 2017 hurricane season. So in Dominica after Hurricane Maria, Barbuda as well after Hurricane Irma, and St. Croix in the US Virgin Islands after Hurricane Maria. So we had been working in the region prior to these events and working with islands on the opportunities for clean energy, local energy, distributed energy to provide benefits in terms of cost and sustainability and local ownership. But the concept of resilience wasn't necessarily front of mind for us, for our partners, until this hurricane season in 2017. Then it became a very central focus for us and added to sort of the list of priorities that different islands have that we're working to solve for and optimize for all of those priorities. So what we saw in the Caribbean in 2017 is that often the transmission and distribution infrastructure, the lines that take electricity from where it's generated to where it's used, see a lot more damage than the generation infrastructure itself. Here's an image of Puerto Rico, the US, and the British Virgin Islands before and then after Hurricane Maria, so you can kind of visualize that impact. And certainly that type of damage is what was seen in the British Virgin Islands. So this little lightning bolt that you see on the island of Tortola is meant to represent the one diesel generating plant that is in the BVI. That plant serves all of Tortola as well as 11 of the other islands that you see here. They're all connected by undersea cable. So there's just one plant, very centralized, that serves everybody. That plant itself didn't see very much damage during the storm. A little bit of water damage. They were able to get it up and running very quickly. But the transmission and distribution infrastructure saw a lot of damage. So all of the overhead lines connecting that one plant to users of electricity on Tortola, the main island in the British Virgin Islands, and then to the undersea cable to the other islands, lots of damage there. And so that's what really caused, it took a lot of time to get people access to electricity again. So where we see the opportunity to flip this is to implement microgrids, adding resilience to the system by creating diversity, both in terms of the type of generation. So rather than relying on one source, relying on multiple things so that there's a better chance that they don't all fail at the same time. And then a more diversity of locations for generation as well. So you can see we're having this one centralized plant creates a single point of failure, either in that plant itself, or like we saw, the plant was okay, but connecting that to everyone else was severely damaged. So you can start to envision what that might look like. Perhaps some solar PV added near the diesel plant to start to get a diversity of generation types. Maybe some solar PV at another point on Tortola, located perhaps by the most critical infrastructure. And these are actually projects that are underway in the British Virgin Islands. So they're working on a solar and storage project at the community college, which is also a hurricane shelter. And the water treatment facilities are in that same location as well. So roughly where that solar icon is, starting to diversify the location of where generation is as well. I gave some more examples here. A wind project is being discussed in Virgin Gorda, one of the islands that is interconnected electrically. Maybe some solar there as well, solar in Anegada. So you can start to see this picture of microgrids adding resilience through diversity in terms of our electricity generation. And the key piece of all of this is energy storage, which we can certainly talk a bit more about if there's interest. But with each of these distributed installations of electricity generation, including some form of energy storage, so that microgrid with the generation and storage can connect to the grid most of the time, provide value and service to the electricity grid, and during a time of an extended grid outage, such as following a hurricane, be able to disconnect and segment, essentially use that local generation with the energy storage to serve the most critical infrastructure while the grid is out. A few more examples of where Caribbean islands are leaders, and there's many more than these. I just wanted to pull a couple out. Bermuda, for example, has a better battery energy storage system. They mostly use it for spinning reserve. So during normal operation, when the grid is running, the battery provides some of the reserve that's required and allows them to save fuel from the diesel generators. But it's there and it can provide other services as well if the grid were out. In Barbados, here's a photo of their solar and storage plant. This one is unique in that it also integrates agriculture. So space tends to be a constraint on islands, of course. There's other important priorities like agriculture. In Barbados, they have sheep that graze among these panels. It means they don't have to come in and cut the grass. The sheep take care of that, and they didn't have to relocate those sheep. They have a place for them to to live. And then on the right here in Abaco in the Bahamas, that was one of the islands most impacted by Hurricane Dorian in 2019. We have been fortunate to be working with the government of the Bahamas and the utility there, Bahamas Power and Light, on a redesign and rebuilding of their electricity system, focused on siting microgrids at the most critical infrastructure. So again, everything's connected electrically, most of the time providing benefits to the full grid. But if that grid were to go down, the hospital will now have its microgrid, the government complex that's also a hurricane shelter, the water treatment facilities. So really looking at where we site these projects to get to that diversity of generation type and location to increase the resilience of the system. And the last thing I wanted to offer is we also think about resilience not just of the system as a whole, but at the project level or the asset level. So if we build a solar PV project in the right location by the most critical facilities, but then that project doesn't survive the storm either, that's not increasing the resilience of the system. So we've taken a really close look after both the 2017 and 2019 hurricane seasons in the Caribbean at some projects like this one pictured here that did not make it through the storm and others that did, and put together a series of reports called Solar Under Storm, which you're welcome to check out on our website here, and shared some best practices there for the design and the installation of solar PV so that that project itself is resilient to hurricane impacts and then can contribute to the resilience of the system as a whole. That was all I wanted to share for now. Really happy to hear from the other speakers and have discussion with all of you today.
Thanks, Kaitlyn. That was awesome. In fact, after talking to you before, I had 7 questions and you answered them all. So I used up all my questions there. For those of you that are watching and participating, if you have a question for the speakers, if you could put it in chat, we'll be collecting those and we're going to try and get to them all at the end. Because as I said, a lot of our questions get answered as the speakers go forward. And if you're not muted when someone else is on there, we'd appreciate if you could mute because my rooster's always crowing and stuff. So I even mute between speakers. The one thing I did notice, Kaitlyn, that I wanted to emphasize was energy storage and location of microgrids for survivability. Could you just comment a little bit about that?
Yes, happy to. We're seeing energy storage being deployed in the Caribbean, sometimes in this microgrid mode that we're talking about, and sometimes just to provide benefit today, to allow the diesel generators that are providing most of the electricity to operate more efficiently. Most islands that we're seeing are pursuing lithium-ion battery solutions, but there's certainly other options there for energy storage. And on the siting part of the question that you mentioned, that's another key component too. Often we see island utilities in the Caribbean site their first battery project right near their current plant. Then it's nearby, it's somewhat comfortable, they can learn about this new technology on their system and see how it operates. And then what we're seeing and what we're supporting and promoting a lot with our partners is starting to site storage and generation at other locations away from the one central plant so that you start to get more of a diversity of location and an opportunity to perhaps segment and keep that portion of the grid or that critical infrastructure running while the main grid or the main plant perhaps has an issue.
Thanks, Kaitlyn. That was awesome. We really appreciate it. Our next presenter is Devin De Wulf. He's the founder of Get Lit, Stay Lit, Crew for Red Beans, and Feed the Second Line, which are some really interesting not-for-profits to start. But Devin is from the Louisiana area, and he has what we would call battery plus solar mini grid or more nano grid residential. And he had some experience in Louisiana during the last hurricane, and he'd like to share them with us. So, Devin, it's all yours.
Well,
Did you not make it?
he didn't make it.
Oh, okay.
He was not here, so we should
Well,
just.
I can share some. We actually pre-interviewed all these folks. And let's just talk a little bit about Devin's experience. He actually has battery and solar on his house, and he lives in a fairly rural area with a lot of low-income folks in the neighborhood. And pretty much after the hurricanes in Louisiana, his neighborhood was decimated, and he found that hardly anyone else in his community had solar plus batteries. And so the folks that had solar, when they tried, they would assume that they would have electricity. They didn't. And a lot of the restaurants and other places had no backup power at all. And their food was spoiling after a couple of days. And basically, they could have helped their own community if some of these small residential and businesses had solar plus battery, so they could provide some resilience for their community. And so his experience was he reported that there were about 200 folks a day rolling up to his house just to charge their cell phones and have that kind of power input to keep them communicating with the outside world. But they were fairly isolated, and it took about a week to get most of the power back on in Louisiana in the impacted areas. And in that time, you know, a lot of the food was spoiled. A lot happened that didn't need to happen if just a handful of businesses and residential folks had some kind of solar and battery backup, so they could charge the solar during the day and then charge the batteries first thing in the morning for nighttime use that night. And another thing that was important was reminded me of Kaitlyn's presentation. Some areas were impacted heavily, other houses weren't even touched. So the fact that you just spread these resources out in your community can do a lot for your resilience. Our next presenter is Allan Schurr from Enchanted Rock, and he's located in Houston, Texas, and he has a presentation for us. He does mostly large-scale microgrids for resiliency for the government, for big industry, and for the military. So, Allan, welcome to the forum, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
It's good to be with you today. I wish I was really with you in Hawaii today. It is now the nice time of year to be in Houston, so I'll live with that. But summers are not that nice. I'm going to talk a little bit about microgrids generally first, and then talk about our experience in supporting our customers during some relatively recent severe weather, extreme weather events, just to talk about kind of the performance and scale of what we do. Let's go to the first chart. First of all, I want to talk about a certain kind of a microgrid. We call them dual purpose microgrids, and really the basis for them is that there's two ways in which a microgrid can create value and create economics to help finance and fund the microgrid. The first factor that we think about is the grid is vulnerable. It's vulnerable for lots of reasons. Crisis events like hurricanes are one of those examples. On the mainland, there's more and more things that are occurring beyond just hurricanes. Wildfires are knocking out either line segments or entire communities. We see straight line winds and other thunderstorms happening in widespread areas that can create long duration outages on the grid. We're seeing icing, the Texas winter storm. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But there's an increased frequency and more damage that's occurring on the grid that causes a lot of businesses now to rethink their need for protection, much like your community is considering it. It's really an inevitability that the grid is going to experience these vulnerabilities. The second part, this is an important part in Hawaii as well. The energy transition is creating a much more difficult job for the grid operators, the utilities, to balance supply and demand. There's more electrification occurring that increases demand relative to the prior consumption patterns. These are electric vehicles, electric heating, but also the volatility of renewables, which I know Hawaii has experienced too, means that there are periods of time where having enough reserve capacity and resources to be able to supply all the desired consumption makes it pretty challenging for the grid operator to have those tools in their toolkit. Again, we can probably point to the Texas winter storm, but there are other examples the mainland where there have been challenges in finding the right kind of supply at the right times. We believe that dual purpose microgrids can meet both of those requirements. They can provide both on-site local resiliency. And again, we deal with very large scale projects, typically a megawatt to 50 megawatts. Just to calibrate that, a McDonald's might be a 50 kilowatt type load. A very large Costco might be a megawatt. Data centers, office buildings, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, all have very large loads. And they tend not to have very much space, but as you heard, you want to have the resiliency asset as close as possible to the load, because even a single line segment can have damage if there are high winds or icing or other factors. So that local installation of a microgrid at the point of consumption, we work behind the meter almost in every case, meaning on the customer side of the utility service entrance. Although we're doing 1,000 customer microgrid in the Chicago area, where we're serving mostly residential and small business, but it's under the sponsorship of the local utility. Those kinds of applications are what allow business to continue to operate in a continuous way without much interruption or any. And I'll give some more examples in a second. Let's go to the next chart. These are the industries that need high resiliency. Some are really obvious, some maybe a little bit less so. Data centers are powering everything. They're powering this call right now, right? If we had a data center that had an outage at this moment, we'd all drop off. It's communications, it's data storage, it's the app on your iPhone. Everything about data centers is now become critical infrastructure. Grocery and distribution used to not be considered this. There we go. It used to be not considered critical infrastructure, but it sure is if your freezer, you've lost all the food in your fridge and you need to eat. Pharmacies are now co-located at most grocery, and we rely a lot on distribution centers to deliver things that we need with more and more e-commerce. Healthcare, pretty obvious there. Interestingly enough, a lot of healthcare does not have full facility backup. And so when emergencies occur, one of the things they go into planning mode is how do they evacuate patients where they weren't in the part of the hospital that is protected by the on-site generation. That seems to us to be the wrong approach to emergency response. Hospitals and healthcare facilities should be open for business, not figuring out how to evacuate due to loss of power. Critical infrastructure, we're talking about water, airports and transportation, even things like prison, communication towers, those are in the critical infrastructure. We serve a number of manufacturing sites. Why is that important? Well, in some cases, they lose a lot of money because of outages, but they're also industrial processes that can cause environmental damage if they have uncontrolled releases due to power failures. And so that's a customer type for us. And as I mentioned, the Chicago Bronzeville microgrid with utilities. Utilities can be an agent for providing wider spread resiliency in a district, in a community. Let's go to the next chart. So a little bit about Enchanted Rock with that backdrop. We've been doing this kind of work since 2009. We've got now about 240 microgrids in commercial operation. Each one of them is roughly a megawatt or larger. This picture in this on this slide here is about a 12 megawatt footprint. It's a natural gas or renewable natural gas based system that is a very compact footprint. The location discussion is an important one to consider. If I were to try to provide 12 megawatts of reliable solar and storage, it would take, this would be about 7,000 square feet for the footprint you see right in front of you. For solar and storage, it would be probably 60 acres and something like 30 times the cost if you wanted to have a 2-day outage protection. So it's very difficult in industrial scale loads because there's such a concentration of power to be able to do that completely with solar and storage. That said, we have probably 25 of our microgrids have solar on site, and they serve to help reduce the customer's bill every day as well as do reduce the fuel that we have to consume during power outages. We've gone through a lot of hurricanes, critical weather, and I want to talk a little bit about that, but it's a very flexible solution for customers as long as we have an underground fuel delivery or on-site fuel storage network. And I know that's a challenge in many island communities. I think on Oahu, there might be some LNG and other liquid propane type fuel supplies that could provide that level of on-site storage or underground delivery. Let's go to the next chart. Let me just talk about 3 examples. These are fairly recent about what it was that the Enchanted Rock microgrids did during those particular events. Hurricane Harvey, that should be 2017, not 2007. 2017 Harvey, a lot of rain, something like 50 inches of rain fell in the Houston area. Even in the surrounding communities, it was significant. And if you've been to the Gulf Coast, there's not very many places for the water to drain. The elevation might be 10 to 50 feet above sea level, so there's a lot of standing water. By itself, that may not cause a lot of power outages, but when you couple it with wind, trees blow over into the power lines, and there was extensive power outages. We operated 21 of our microgrids for over 100 hours, supporting mostly grocery customers that we have to maintain food supply during the Harvey event. One of our customers actually had the National Guard use it as a base of operation because there was food and bathrooms and refrigeration for things while they were staging to do rescues and other things. There's some interesting stories of helicopters flying out into communities to pick up workers so they could come and work at these facilities. But that was our first really large scale operation in 2017, not 2007. Hurricane Hannah was last year in early in the season in June. It happened down in the southern part of Texas. What was notable about this is it was originally expected to go ashore about 150 miles to the north of where it ultimately went ashore. You can see it kind of took a veer there in the photo there, more in a westerly direction, and a lot of pre-staging that normally happens in preparation for hurricanes with many businesses where they're rolling in mobile generators or other precautions they might take. They completely missed what happened down in the Rio Grande Valley. We operated 29 microgrids during that event. We preemptively put them in island mode, meaning we took them off of the grid so that as the winds came on shore, there were no interruptions with any of those facilities. They were open completely during that couple of days where power outages were occurring. 49 hours was the maximum. I think a total of those 29 microgrids, 13 of them would have had power outages as long as those 2 days. Significant product loss, of course. That's the business reason a lot of companies go into backup power or microgrids. It so turns out that it's such an important community resource that the companies that do this have experienced sales increases that persist beyond emergencies because they are providing a higher level of service to their customers. Again, grocery and refueling centers were the primary customers for that. That was all the warm-up act for this winter in Winter Storm Uri. I'm sure it was in the news in Hawaii. It was across more than just the Texas market. It was really the Southern Plains. A polar vortex came in. To give you a sense of how cold it got, almost all the palm trees in Houston are dead because the temperatures were down in single digits. It just doesn't happen very often. Well, if you look at historically, it does happen periodically, and the palm trees come back or replanted. But this was a really significant event for lots of reasons. The infrastructure wasn't damaged from winds. It was cold temperature events that both increased demand and caused problems with the power generation infrastructure. Wind turbines were available, even though there were lots of photos floating around of frozen wind turbines. They really weren't frozen, but there was no wind. In polar vortex situations, the wind's not blowing. There was also cloud cover because of some snowfall and icing that was occurring. We were getting almost no solar out of that system. The ERCOT market is a 70,000 or so megawatt system, and renewables were delivering not the usual 25 to 30,000 megawatts, but closer to 1,500 megawatts. So we had a significant deficit in renewables. That left the fossil generating plant to be what people were leaning on. And that was, and some nuclear. The gas plants, some of the coal plants weren't winterized, they froze. And so we had a deficit, and there were rotating outages that were occurring across the state. About 20,000 megawatts of rotating outages occurred. The overall event was an 8-day event, but 3 days of rotating outages, and significant problems from rotating outages because in part there weren't as many opportunities to rotate as customers would have expected, because critical infrastructure was protected from rotating outages, and therefore there was less flexibility for the grid operator to rotate. Some customers had 60 straight hours without power. It was really a catastrophe from that standpoint. We operated about 200 hours in total because the market needed power even before the rotating outages. And even after a lot of these bigger generators were spun back up, there was still shortfall in the market. And so we were selling power to the grid before and after the rotating outage period and supported a wide array of customers. 142 sites would have had power outages, but for our microgrids. And we had excellent performance, very high 90s percentage availability in conditions that were both cold, there was no wind, no solar. The underground gas infrastructure worked extremely well at the pressures that we require. And so we were both providing backup power, and when we had power and the grid was available again, we were providing grid stability services to the ERCOT operator. There were significant operating issues that were going on. We were pushing out live software updates to the microgrids so that they could adapt to changing conditions. I would just say this is probably the best proof point of microgrids operating to support real infrastructure at large scale of any example that I know of anywhere in the world, really. And they proved themselves to be really the essential component of the Texas economy. A lot of diesel generators failed. We've done some survey work. It was, again, roughly 50% of diesel generators had problems either starting, maintaining their voltage, or they couldn't get refueling because trucks couldn't go get refilled icy roads. The depots had power outages, so there was no way to get fuel, whereas the gas infrastructure continued to flow. So those are just some recent examples. It sure helps to have a infinite fuel supply from the underground gas infrastructure that allows you to operate very flexibly in both grid support mode and during long duration outages. And hurricanes in Hawaii, I think, would be viewed as a long duration event depending on the damage level and the location. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Allan. And one question that I thought of with the help of one of the folks on the chat was, most businesses work on pretty thin margins, and especially during COVID, we had a lot of small businesses folding because they're really in a tight margin in terms of profit. How do you finance those dual purpose grids to give you the protection in the event of a disaster that may only happen once every 10 years or so? I mean, how do those companies and how do individuals look for financing to make sure they're prepared for these kind of events and still stay competitive? Is that something where the government might need to come in and give some guidance or give some incentives?
I think there is public money potentially for certain critical infrastructure, but a grocery store is unlikely to get that kind of grant money or a subsidy. This is where the dual purpose microgrid is really a game changer. The value of those grid services that we provide, which might only be for 200 or 300 hours a year, that's when the grid is really under duress and there's a need for fast starting, fast ramping resources. Those are extremely valuable hours, and they do a significant job in paying for that microgrid. based on grid services. If it weren't for those services that we provide, as an example, there would be a peaking plant that would have to go get built, and that gets paid for in customer rates. So having an on-demand, fast ramping resource is valuable to the grid operators. They pay for that. They will, those dollars over the life of the asset can fund a significant portion of that microgrid so that the host customer that's looking for backup doesn't have to pay the $500 a kilowatt that a diesel generator would charge. And some of our customers, they pay more like $100 to $150 a kilowatt. So it's a much more affordable resource. It's not for every business, but if you experience damage to your business once every 10 years, you can do the math. If it's more frequent, there's severe weather that happens in some parts of the country where their calculus might be more than once every 10 years. It could be once a year or more often. So the dual purpose microgrids, the model that lets resiliency become more affordable based on existing market economics without a subsidy being required or a government grant.
Great, thank you so much for that. And thanks for your presentation. I think we'll probably get some more questions on the chat, but our next presenter is Mr. Paul Ponthieux. He's going to give us a quick overview of what he's working on with microgrids, and I'm going to say plural because he actually runs two up in North Kona on the Big Island. And a lot of people don't really realize that here in Hawaii, folks have been working on microgrids and renewable energy for a long time. And I've worked with Paul for over a decade on things like hydrogen. So Paul, take it away. Unmute.
Yep, I'm going to share my screen.
By the way, that picture in the background when Paul's picture was up there was the lab that he designed. He's an architect. That one right there.
Right. Okay, so you can see it on the screen now?
Yes.
All right, so this is an aerial shot of our energy lab. But first of all, what is Blue Planet Research? We're kind of an applied engineering lab. We're not an academic lab. So we do testing pretty much on real world scale on projects. And let's see. This is a software program that we developed over about 7 years. It was originally designed for our Mars Habitat project up on Mauna Loa. But at the ranch here, we have a microgrid of 32 acres, and we have a redundant generation and storage system at two different points on the property. We have a total of about 250 kilowatt hours of battery storage. We use lithium ferrous phosphate made by Sony, and we have about 135 kilowatts of PV between the two structures. So they feed into an underground microgrid at 7,200 volts AC. And to control those from backfeeding each other, this program does it by telling one to be in grid forming mode and the other to sell to our own grid. So every second we give it a new value to sell so it doesn't backfeed each other. It works pretty well. We have another little microgrid up on Mauna Loa, which is our Mars Habitat, and it uses the same systems that we have here at the ranch: solar, lithium ferrous phosphate batteries, and we have a hydrogen fuel cell as the backup for that. We have the community's water well happens to be on the ranch. It's 2,500 feet deep. It supplies 165 water meters in the community. And we recently went online with a solar project that took way too long to get through the county and state, but it's operational now. And it's consists of about 350 kilowatts of PV and then a 1 megawatt hour battery. So the container is the 1 megawatt hour battery. And it has 480 Sony modules in it to make up that 1 megawatt. And it's actually redundant. It's actually two 500 kilowatt hour banks that we can turn off individually. So we have to do maintenance. We can shut down half and keep it running. Our other form of storage is hydrogen, as Stan mentioned. We take all of our excess solar energy. First of all, we have a microclimate up here. We're at about 3,000 foot elevation. And in the mornings, it's typically clear blue skies like it is right now. And by 11 or 12 noon, it becomes overcast. So we are oversized to be able to accommodate that weather and operate even in bad conditions. But in the morning, we have a lot of excess energy. So besides using it to charge the batteries and charge electric vehicles, we take the excess and we split water into hydrogen and oxygen. We store the hydrogen for backup fuel cells as well as transportation and also for cooking. Here's our fueling station that allows us to fuel the Toyota Mirai that we have now as part of a project called Aloha Hydrogen. It holds 6 kilograms at 6,000 and it lets us fill up the car to get about 150 miles range on it, since it can only do half the tank right now. There's the car being fueled in front of the lab. It's a really nice car, the Toyota Mirai. And for those who don't know, Mirai means future in Japanese. And here's a walk burner running on hydrogen. We use this for educational purposes, demonstrations. We've cooked events with it. And we basically show people, whenever I give tours, the safety of hydrogen by explaining a couple of properties of hydrogen that actually make it very safe. One is the buoyancy. It's 14 times lighter than air, so it goes up at 45 miles per hour. That's 66 feet a second. So by the time you say 1001, it's 6 stories away. The second is the lack of carbon in hydrogen as a pure fuel makes very little radiant heat. So it has very little radiant energy. And usually during the demonstrations, I'll put my finger about 1/8 inch from the flame on the sides, and it doesn't burn. The heat goes straight up where you want it to go. And that's one of the things that makes it safer than any other flammable gas. Most hydrocarbon flammable gases are heavier than air, so they just flow into the room like water and wait. Hydrogen is really hard to contain, to get it into a dangerous condition. But every time we do a tour, there's always somebody who brings up the Hindenburg and says, you know, isn't hydrogen dangerous? It's so explosive. Well, it's not explosive, it's flammable, and anything can be explosive under the right conditions. So we try to educate people about the misinformation and about the Hindenburg. And this is a picture of a grain elevator in New Orleans, where I'm from, that blew up across the Mississippi River and shook homes for about 10 miles around. It was one of the most powerful explosions. So grain dust can be explosive under the right conditions. And next slide is not going. Okay. Oh, because that was it. So that's basically, you know, the overview of what we do over here. And let me come back to.
I got a couple of questions for you, Paul. Number one, you talked about lithium ferrous phosphate batteries. Can you share with most people are used to hearing about lithium ion batteries, and but lithium ferrous phosphate's a different lithium chemistry in batteries. Could you just spend a couple of seconds talking about that so people know the difference?
Sure. So LFP, lithium ferrous phosphate, it's also called lithium iron phosphate. It was developed by Hydro-Quebec, and their first licensee was Sony. That's how we got involved with it, with Sony. LFP has a lot of advantages over typical lithium chemistries, which are cobalt. So NMC and aluminum cobalt chemistries have an issue with thermal runaway, so they have to be kept cool. The advantage of the cobalt chemistries is that it's lighter. It's also more energy dense than LFP. but the thermal management issues make it less desirable for stationary storage. So we don't use cobalt in any of our systems. We actually created the blue ion line of batteries, which are LFP, and they're being used in Puerto Rico extensively. LFP is so much safer. It's a little bit heavier, but the safety factor makes it superior to the cobalt chemistry solutions. If you've ever seen a Tesla car fire or even a large megawatt class installation of cobalt batteries, it can be really, really dangerous and hard to deal with. The LFP is so simple, it doesn't need any cooling, even at most of the C rates that you can charge and discharge it. So that's why we use LFP, basically.
Thanks. And one other quick question. Could you just give us a cost comparison by kilowatt hour of storage of batteries compared to hydrogen?
Yeah, so one of the things that we promote and we've been testing for a long time is the true cost of storage, basically. And there's a point where you can store a lot of energy. And I'll give an example. The military, for example, because we work with Pahakaloa training area a lot, they need 14 days of autonomy. So they could do it with batteries, but it would be ridiculously expensive to just warehouse electrons for weeks, months at a time without using them. So the best combination is actually to do hydrogen and batteries. Use your batteries for your power and use the hydrogen for the energy for long-term storage. The advantage of that is the cost reduction is dramatic, but also the same equipment that makes your hydrogen, once your tanks are filled, can still make hydrogen for other uses like cooking and transportation and other things. That 1 megawatt hour battery in the container that I showed earlier, that cost about $600,000 for that 1 megawatt hour. In the same container, I could put 4 to 6 megawatt hours of hydrogen storage in 2 tanks. And it would be about 1/4 of the cost of the battery. So 1/3 to 1/4, depending on if it's 4 or 6. So there's a huge advantage to combining the chemistries together in the storage. So that's what we promote.
All right, thanks, Paul. I noticed that Devin is on now. He's on the phone talking to somebody, I think. But maybe we can catch up with him on his presentation. One more quick question then, Paul. With you have 2 different kind of grids basically. Well, your Mars habitat and your Pu'uwawa grid are islanded already, but the water well grid is grid tied to Hawaiian Electric Light Company on the Big Island. Right. Can you just kind of talk about how that works between the two and what they're purpose built for?
Yeah, so originally we wanted to take the well off grid as well, and we were talked out of it by the community water company. They wanted the security of having it. So at least until we can prove that it can be resilient, we're grid tied. So we have a hybrid system. Of the 350 kilowatts of PV, about 1/3 of that is AC coupled and the rest is DC coupled to the battery. So we have the capability of islanding the well whenever it needs to be. If the grid goes down, it's automatic. And again, that's controlled by the same EMCC program that runs the ranch grid. And it allows us to optimize the energy flow between all the different sources to where it's really needed. So we typically try to keep the battery up to a certain percent in case the grid goes down. But there are times when we do 100% discharge. And that's the other advantage of LFP. You can really discharge it heavily from 0 to 100% down to 0 over and over again with very little degradation compared to the cobalt chemistries.
All right, thanks, Paul. And we got Devin up. Devin, are you ready to do your presentation?
Yeah, I can talk. I really apologize for my time mix-up.
No, we know you just changed from daylight savings, so it's confusing. Hawaii never changes, and we get messed up all the time.
Well, I thought it was at 7 p.m. Central Time, and I'm totally wrong. So I apologize. And unfortunately,
No sweat.
I need to leave in 10 minutes because we just bought a building, and the repairman is coming 2 hours late, but he's coming right now. So I'm about to have to go and meet him.
Okay, well, you got 9 minutes.
Yeah. In the short time that I'll have, I'll just share my experience. I'm a community organizer in New Orleans, Louisiana. And during COVID, I've been very active creating jobs and helping the community because we have a lot of artists and musicians here in our city that are really struggling with the loss of tourism from COVID. So New Orleans has really struggled. And then on top of it, we had Hurricane Ida, which was a Category 4 hurricane. Conveniently, it arrived on the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and it really devastated South Louisiana. My city, New Orleans, was pretty lucky comparatively because Ida, as it hit Louisiana, it kind of did a little zigzag, and it spared New Orleans the brunt of the damage. We probably had a Category 3 hurricane where our neighbors had a Category 4 hurricane. So we had roof damage here. They had total destruction about 20 miles away, just to try to put it into perspective. My house has solar panels and 2 Tesla batteries, which we got a long time ago because my wife is an ER doctor, and we assumed that she would have to return to New Orleans after a hurricane to go to work. And so we wanted our house to be prepared for that moment because we have 2 small children, 4 and 6 years old. So we wanted to be able to live here even if the city had no power. Hurricane Ida knocked out the entire power grid of the city of New Orleans for 10 days. And we actually didn't evacuate for the storm because my wife had to work. So for 10 days, we lived here with power because our system worked really well. And it was an eye-opening experience for me as a community organizer because, as you can imagine, me being here with some of my neighbors here, I tried to help them in any way I could. Having power when nobody else had power made a huge difference. For example, after a major hurricane, keeping your cell phone charged is essential. My front porch was a phone charging station for the community. From 6 in the morning to 7 o'clock at night, anybody could come charge up their phones. Importantly, when people were waiting, charging their phones, I could offer them ice water. If you've ever been to New Orleans, you know that it can get really hot. Our city lost 12 people to heat exhaustion in the 10 days that we had no power. And I can tell you the temperature was easily 100 degrees every day. So you're talking about 9 in the morning to 7 o'clock at night, it's 100 degrees with 100% humidity. And if you can't cool off, it can be deadly. So we didn't run our air conditioning here because I didn't want to drain the battery too bad, but we had fans, we had ice makers, we could give people cold drinks, and that really makes a big difference, especially for elderly people. In any hurricane, the people who have money will evacuate, and the people who cannot afford to evacuate will stay behind. It doesn't matter how big the storm is, it's always going to be that case because any natural disaster basically shows the inequity of the society. Because my house had power and because most of my neighbors who could not evacuate stayed behind, my house was basically a little hub of resiliency for my neighborhood. We never saw any local, state, or federal government agency here or official in the 10 days. The nearest, city feeding center was a couple miles away. And after a hurricane, there's no gas. So you can't really leave your neighborhood very easily. And so my house was really helpful for my neighbors. Mr. Joe, who's elderly, in the backyard, I could run an extension cord and hook up his refrigerator during the daylight. Mr. Roy is another elder neighbor who lives 2 doors down. He needs an oxygen machine. So we ran an extension cord, and that might have been the difference between him having a medical emergency and not having a medical emergency. And when people threw out their food, I could take it. I could restock my freezer basically with their food, as my neighbors had to, try to figure out what to do with their frozen food that was getting wasted. Because of my work in the community, I got a lot of phone calls from hotel restaurants and other restaurants, basically like, hey, we have walk-in coolers full of food. Can you do something about it? And, I couldn't because of the circumstance. But those phone calls and my experience with my neighbors really led me to this idea that we call Get Lit, Stay Lit. And the idea is that we need to get restaurants equipped with solar and batteries, because when a hurricane comes, that restaurant can serve their community. They can serve their neighborhood. And since we know that poverty exists and we can look at the map of New Orleans, we can find the neighborhoods that have higher rates of poverty, AKA those are the places where more people are going to stay during a hurricane. So those are the places that need immediate support the day after the hurricane. And if we give the restaurants the tools needed to do that, they're not going to waste their walk-in freezer full of food. When that food goes to waste, it creates methane. And it creates a good amount of methane if you're a restaurant, because you might have 2,000 pounds of food in your walk-in. And I know this from talking to chefs who can show you, oh, this is my insurance claim. This is the spreadsheet that I made. Here's all the protein. Here's all the vegetables. Here's all the cheeses that went to waste. In the 10 days that I spent in my neighborhood with no government support, I could tell that people were going hungry. And if you drove around New Orleans after a couple of days, you could see it too in the people on the street. So we have hunger and epic amounts of food waste happening at the same time. We also have a situation where elderly people are dying because of heat exhaustion, because there's not enough cooling centers. There's not enough places they can get ice. It's hard to get a meal. So it's hard to charge your cell phone. All of these problems can be solved equipping the restaurants with solar and batteries. Now, the best part about it, in my opinion, and the thing that I would love to share with y'all in Hawaii is ever since COVID started, the work that I've done, has basically been one idea after another to generate jobs in my community and put people to work doing different things. Like when our parades were canceled, we hired the artists to make house float decorations, and it just created jobs. Or when Jazz Fest was canceled, we recreated the festival as backyard concerts and crowdsourced money to hire everybody. Between all the different initiatives, since COVID started, I've created basically $1 million worth of jobs. And that has employed people and really helped people not get evicted, help them put food on the table, all this stuff. And it's really warped my philosophy and my thinking on stuff, because what I've learned over that course of COVID, and this is my philosophy now, nobody cares about us. Not a single person cares about my city as much as I do. And in the same vein of thought, nobody cares about Hawaii except you guys. If there's a hurricane that hits Hawaii, it'll be in the news in America on the mainland for like a couple days. And then something else is going to happen and we're going to forget about it. Just like you guys forgot about Hurricane Ida that hit us after a couple days, you move on with your life. I think it's human nature. And if you lean into that thought, if you say nobody cares about us, then that's why you have to care about your place and do everything you really can to prepare your community and fight for your community and improve your community. So that's my philosophy. With the restaurants, if we get them solar and batteries, they can save money every month on their bills. So what I'm going to do is ask them to put money back into the program. If one restaurant contributes $200 a month back into our initiative, it's not really a big deal. But if 300 restaurants contribute every single month $200, that means every single month I can fully fund another restaurant to get solar and batteries. And this creates a pathway where I could get it not only in my city, in every neighborhood in my city, but then I could go to South Louisiana, and then I could go to the Gulf South, and then I could go to Florida and up the East Coast. And eventually, this is how we could really help every single community get prepared for a hurricane. Because when a hurricane hits, nobody's going to care about y'all. Just like nobody's going to care about my city like I will. And that's really the important thing. And, I realize the other thing I'm going to do is start to get sponsor companies like, hey, donate $2,500 a month. You're one of 300 companies that gets to say you care about the community and you're helping us prepare for a hurricane. And again, I'm just going to try to fully fund another restaurant every single month. And the other good thing is I can do this without talking about me being an environmentalist, because I'm not an environmentalist, really. I'm a hurricane prepper, which is way less politically charged. So I can go talk to the most conservative Republican person in Louisiana and just say, bruh, nobody cares about us. We got to get ready. We got to get our community ready for the next hurricane, because you know that one's coming here. So that's basically my story in short. I'm, again, 100% apologetic of my mixing up the time, but I put my email and my phone number in there if anybody wants to get in touch. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to share the experience. If anyone wants to see our initiative, I'll put the website on there too. And I'm sorry I have to run away now.
Hey, Devin, thanks again. And thanks for your what you're doing for your community and giving us some good ideas over there. We're really running short on time. Paul, go ahead. We got 2 seconds.
Devin, where's your neighborhood?
I live in Bywater in New Orleans, the 9th Ward.
I know where it's at. I'm from New Orleans too.
Oh, okay. Right on.
Right. Thanks, Devin. Our final speaker is Ken Aramaki from Hawaiian Electric, and he's going to be giving us some insight in the last 15 minutes or so of what Hawaiian Electric's doing to get us ready for our next disaster, and also just planning for the eventuality of being 100% renewable by 2045. So, Ken, hand it over to you.
Okay, can you see my screen and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Oh, I gotta follow Devin's speech. Thank you everyone for having me. Ken Aramaki, I'm the Director of Transmission and Distribution Planning, or Transmission, Distribution and Interconnection Planning at Hawaiian Electric. Myself and my team is in charge of planning the transmission and distribution grid to meet future energy needs. Which includes, by demand or loads, as well as providing capacity to support utility scale or distributed energy resources. So we're a little short on time, so I'll kind of go quickly, and these will be available later, I think. But just reiterating, we are alone. We, the nearest state is 2,500 miles away. We need to be self-reliant. We need to be self-resilient. We recently issued a climate change action plan to reduce our carbon emissions 70% by 2030. And complementary to that, we've been already working on these renewable goals, which is to get to 100% renewable by 2045. So far, we're on track. We beat our 2020 target, which was 30%, and we are currently at 35% renewable energy. And in terms of rooftop solar, we serve 468,000 customers. Of that, about 19.5% of our customers have some form of rooftop solar, which also helps us meet our renewable energy targets. I think Eugene actually said this. In 2007, our rooftop energy solar systems were about 370 total. Currently, we're at 91,000. Okay, so into the resilience discussion. We're self-reliant, we're self-resilient. We need to make sure that we can withstand and or recover from these types of events. We are long overdue for an event, and we want to be able to recover from these types of situations. So in terms of resilience, resilience covers high impact, low frequency events. So usually at the utility, we differentiate between reliability, which covers, kind of the various traditional types of things that we look at, and longer term events which impact us for a longer duration is looked at in resilience. So hurricanes, storms, earthquakes, other extreme events. Also included in there are cybersecurity. And then to meet those, we look at hardening infrastructure as well as microgrids. So at Hawaiian Electric, we adopted the definition for resilience. Resilience is the ability of a system or its components to adapt to changing conditions and withstand and rapidly recover from disruptions. So kind of a broad definition. And with that broad definition, we also treat resilience in a broad manner. So, today we're gonna kind of touch on infrastructure, through the microgrid discussion. But, we also look at withstanding cybersecurity events. We also train regularly, at least annually. We do emergency response training so that we have the organization in place to support a recovery. We also have mutual aid agreements in place with other utilities. So as events happen either in the US or here, we can work with our partners to either support them or they can help support us in these events. And also inventory management, we also make sure that we have key components available as we have spare key components available on island to support recovery. So for resilience, we look at it in terms of we call this the bow tie approach. So on the left side, there are preventative solutions, which are solutions to prevent outages or damages. And then complementary to that is solutions to mitigate the impacts on the right side, mitigation solutions to mitigate the impact of an event should there be a failure. So on the left side, there's transmission hardening, which is putting up, I guess, stronger poles and circuits, as well as in hardening critical circuits. So looking at circuits that feed, critical customers or critical for restoration purposes. We also look at pole or line relocation, so areas that are more prone to specific events, or maybe they have much more vegetation or things of that nature. Also wildfire prevention, so kind of working with the pole and line relocation, but also looking at other ways to sense or mitigate the impacts of wildfire. At our substations, when we have heavy floods, we do get flooding in the substation, so we try to mitigate that. Also vegetation management, we're constantly cutting trees around the islands to mitigate that, and looking at undergrounding solutions, so taking overhead circuits and placing them underground where appropriate. So in terms of mitigating solutions, I know we're kind of short on time, so microgrids, that's kind of going to be the key in the next few slides. One thing I want to point out that we are looking at is this concept called critical customer hubs. That's one where we make an area or community ready to be sort of like a microgrid. So we look at hardening the lines, putting in switches so they can be isolated. And if an event does happen and the grid goes down, that area is ready to have like a diesel generator rolled in or another type of energy storage source to provide energy to that community. And so one of the places that we're looking at putting that in is the Ko'olaupoko area, which is the windward side of Oahu. Okay, so microgrids in Hawaii. We have and I actually touched on some of these things in the chat. We have a rule number 30. Our programs are governed by rules on our website. So I have the site on the bottom of the slide there. But rule number 30 is a recent, we recently finalized that, which is the microgrid services tariff. And what that does is it supports private development of what are called full feeder microgrids or partial feeder microgrids, as well as single or multi-customer microgrids. So in the diagram on the right, basically, and it's hard to find good diagrams for these, but in the green is an area that is fed off of a distribution substation. So basically off of a feeder of a substation. And the hybrid microgrid allows development of something like that, where you have utility lines within the microgrid boundary. You may have several resources shown as gens in here. And a private developer could potentially aggregate these resources and serve the loads within that microgrid through the rule number 30. And then at a smaller scale, there's partial feeder microgrids, which are shown in this peach or pink area. And then the other one is that it clarifies single or multi-customer microgrids. In Hawaii, we already have those in place, but the rule number 30 clarifies what the functions are for those types of microgrids. And so, for example, folks that have rooftop solar with battery energy storage, that's and they have the ability to island. Those are essentially microgrids.
Ken, so, when you say rule number 30, does that correlate to a PUC rule?
Yep. There's a, yeah, so this link takes you to a tariff rule. Yep. And then on top of that, so that's like the private development side. In terms of utility scale microgrids, we do have the Schofield Generating Station, which most of you may have heard about. That Schofield Generating Station is a generator that has the capability to island off and support 3 military installations. I think it's Schofield, I put it in the chat, Schofield Barracks, Wheeler Army Airfield, and Field Station Kunia. So if the grid goes down, the Army has a resilience service that can feed them. Other things that we are looking at is in North Kohala. North Kohala is a community of about 2,000 residents. They're served by one transmission line currently. So when we have to do maintenance on that transmission line, or if that transmission line goes out, the customers are out because that's their one way of being fed. So what we have done is we submitted to the PUC a draft RFP to put in an energy storage system to provide backup during those times when that line goes out. So that's a future microgrid that we are working on. And then another kind of example is in Hana. That substation that feeds Hana is also fed similarly to North Kohala, where it's fed by one radial transmission line. But at Hana, we have generators that have the ability to provide backup energy in case that transmission line goes out. And so for future kind of other microgrid related initiatives, currently the microgrid services tariff, rule number 30, it enables the development of these microgrids, of private hybrid microgrids. Phase 2 is going to look at other areas, including compensating for various services for those microgrids. And then the company, so, when looking at the full or partial feeder microgrid, that's a fairly complex arrangement. And, it includes multiple customers and it includes utility lines within that. So what we recognized in developing that that program was that normal customers wouldn't have otherwise known where they could actually place these microgrids. So what we did was we kind of luckily at the same time there was this ETIP opportunity, the Energy Transitions Initiative Partnership Project. And so basically we work with the national labs and we're just starting up right now, but we're trying to map out potential opportunities to develop hybrid microgrids on Oahu. And so that with that map, the customers can kind of have an overlay of where there's potential to be to put in these hybrid microgrids. And then lastly, the thing I wanted to mention was the critical customer hubs. I did kind of speak about that in Ko'olapoko. And really what those are microgrid ready projects to improve resilience. So when the grid goes down, there's a way to create an islanded community. And I got some more links in here and that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. I appreciate it. We're really right at the end of our time, but I'd like to turn it kind of over to Ida for a second. Can we keep on going for a few minutes for those that can stick around, Ida?
Sure, we can do that.
Okay, we'll do that. And then also, I was kind of trying to monitor some of the questions that came in on chat, and I think I tried to put them into the presentations there. But Ida, do you see any that you feel like we should be putting out there and continue our Q&A session?
Yeah, I think so. We have one here from Christian Perner to Ken. So she's asking, what would something like Enchanted Rocks DPM be considered? Would Rule 30 apply to that?
Yeah, I think Enchanted Rocks kind of talked about what we call customer microgrids. So microgrids sited on the behind the meter or not using utility lines. So I think those would apply, not necessarily to Rule 30. We have what's called a standard interconnection agreement that allows for placing resources on the customer side.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, guess this one goes to multiple of you, if I can find the question again. With regards to equity, and it's from, let's see, Monique here. And I think, Kaitlyn, you answered some of it, but I wanted to ask it to multiple of you. Issues of equity and ways to address the equity issue in terms of resilience. And for example, in most of the customers in Hawaii tend to be wealthier homeowners, not renters. And those capable of having solar plus battery storage tends to live in wealthier communities. What happens when a hurricane or natural disaster hits low-income communities hardest? Was this an issue in Texas, and how can it be best addressed?
I'll just say, this is Stan, I'll just say that, that's kind of typical. And I think that part of the answer is what Devin was talking about, and that is everybody at the small scale going at the community level and encouraging, I mean, that's why we brought Devin in, encouraging businesses to work at their own mini grid level to run their freezers and refrigerators and medication refrigeration and things like that where possible. And we have projects like GEM, which is a state financing project for solar. that can help lower income people get help putting solar and things on. I noticed in Ken's presentation that moving the generator to a local location and plugging it into a substation is also an option that Hawaiian Electric's looking at for equity. And the idea there is, okay, make sure we have those identified those locations so that we can serve those communities equitably. And that's a government function. I think that's something Hawaiian Electric and the counties have to work on together to see who they're gonna take care of. I don't know if Ken's his picture's not on now, but he's still on. We had one other question in the chat that talked about the coastal location for power generation. You know, historically, Hawaiian Electric has had power generation in downtown Honolulu, at the Ka'i power plant in Pearl City. I can tell you as a former National Guard officer that if we had a Cat 4 hurricane come rolling up and basically make landfall in Waianae, it would pretty much take out every power station that we have on Oahu to generate power. And being that most grids are designed to push power out from a central location, you know, that's a kind of a tough one, especially if it was a tsunami or a bad hurricane hitting the south shore of Oahu. How does Hawaiian Electric look at those kind of scenarios, Ken?
Yeah, good question. And you know, part of what helps that is the recent procurements that are going on and future procurements to displace these resources. So we're going to have more distributed utility scale resources around the island, pushing out energy into the system. So that'll help with that. And recent advancements in technology, especially on the battery storage end, allows for what's called grid forming technology. And so that helps with the providing that voltage to the system when everything else is down.
Great, thanks. Back to you, Ida.
Okay, I think we got one more question here that's for Ken as well. Can you differentiate between Rule 30 and CBRE, being community-based renewable energy?
Yeah, sure. So CBRE is they're both different because CBRE is kind of like a centralized generating resource that can provide energy similar to any other type of, I guess, renewable resource. Rule 30, what that allows is that with the combination of various resources, including it could be, I mean, you know, like rooftop solar or energy storage with multiple customers. Rule 30 allows you to kind of aggregate those resources within a boundary, and then provide energy to that microgrid itself. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Ken.
Would that also apply to, you know, we have basically grid tied microgrids and independent standalone off the grid microgrids. So whenever you're touching HECO's grid, all of the PUC rules and HECO's safety rules kick in, because, you know, if you have solar generating power and you're backfeeding their lines while they have linemen trying to work on them, that would be a really dangerous situation. So when you do these microgrids, you always have to be, if they're grid tied in particular, you have to be working with HECO to make sure that you're in compliance with all the rules and the PUC regulations that impact them and all the safety regulations. So I think that's going to about wrap it up for today. And we only went 5 minutes over. That's not too bad. I'd like to thank Michael Markrich for creating this forum, and many thanks to Ida Taylor for her incredible organizational skills and putting up with Michael and I primarily. I'd like to thank Ramona, Stephen, and Sid for their help, and all the folks at Renew Rebuild Hawaii for putting this together. And you can log on to the Renew Rebuild Hawaii website and look for our next forum, and also help move Hawaii forward with Hawaiian spirit and values. So aloha, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael for last words.
I want to thank Stan. Thank you for being a host. And I want to thank Kaitlyn and Allan and Ken and all of our speakers and Paul for coming, spending your time and speaking to us and giving us this valuable point of view from outside Hawaii. We really appreciate it. And so thank you.
All right, aloha everyone. Thanks for joining us. And again, look on Renew, Rebuild Hawaii and look for the next get together we have, and we'll cover some great topics. Thanks again to all our presenters and for everyone's participation. Aloha.